This is the video sparking outrage online.
Hi.
Hello.
A delivery driver dropping off a $20 pizza to a woman in Texas. Nothing unusual until this exchange.
Thank you.
You're welcome. I just want to say it's a nice house for a $5 tip.
You're welcome.
DoorDash telling ABC News they've removed the driver from their platform.
I think that he was wrong in this situation. This pizza was $20. So what she tipped him was even more than 20%, which I think that's totally acceptable. You know, pizza delivery, it usually is like $5. That's a 20% on a pizza. He's absolutely wrong in that. But I know that there are a lot of delivery drivers who get stiffed all the time because people don't think that they should have to tip on a delivery, which yes, you do. Personally, I tip when I pick up food. I don't think that's something that needs to be forced upon people. I don't tip 20% if it was a big order, if it was a lot to put together.
Tips went up more than 25% at restaurants and nearly 17% at quick service establishments in 2022. And with tipping options now standard at many registers, some customers are reaching a tip fatigue tipping point. Workers say it's awkward for them too.
We understand that you can't always afford to tip, so if you can't afford to tip, I personally would rather you still come and get your hair done and not tip that day.
Now, a lot of workers across industries rely almost exclusively on tips for their income.
Okay, one of the reasons why I hate this debate, it pits people against workers, working people against the working people. Because we say the same shit over and over again, right? It's not the workers' fault, and it's especially not workers' fault who work in situations where they do rely on tips. It's the companies. Now, for some restaurants, there are some small mom and pop type restaurants that it's harder for them to be able to pay their workers more than it would be for a corporation, right? Still, it's bullshit either way that customers are expected to keep service workers afloat. I do feel a little bit of stress every time there's a tipping screen and the employee is looking at you. And I mean in a situation where there's this coffee shop that I go to where I usually get a coffee and then that's it. And I tip every time. One, I can afford to tip $1. And two, it's my neighborhood spot. So they all know us, we know them. And so there's just kind of that familiarity there. But I understand why people feel a pressure or a tipping guilt when they're presented with a screen and when the employee is standing there. But you can do it, okay? You don't need to feel badly in many of these situations for not tipping.
Tipping culture has gotten out of control. I get up to the pay window and she's like, how much do you want to tip? What am I going to tip you for? I'm in the drive-thru. Oh my
I hate the positing of this argument though, where people are getting mad at the workers. Don't be making TikToks being like, I'm so sick of these workers when they turn the iPad around and there's tipping options. Enough is enough. No, let's not do it that way, okay?
During the 1950s, people commonly tipped 10% of the bill. By the 1970s and 1980s, that jumped to 15%. Today, people tip anywhere from 15 to 25%. According to one 2022 survey, consumers said they tipped more than 21% on average.
Nowadays, there are people who argue 20% is kind of a cheap tip.
While the percentage that consumers are tipping at full-service restaurants in the past couple of years has remained about the same, in the fourth quarter of 2022, the number of tips provided at full-service restaurants grew 17%. Meanwhile, the tip frequency at quick-service restaurants such as coffee shops and fast food chains rose 16% during the same time period.
What we're seeing now nationwide is something that is known as Tipflation. At every opportunity, we're being presented with a tablet that's asking us how much we'd like to tip.
In many cases, not only replacing the old-fashioned tip jars that you could feel good about throwing some spare change into, but actually suggesting tip amounts, often right in front of the employee receiving that tip. Not to mention also your dinner date and the dozen or so people standing behind you in line.
And it's gone beyond just the tablets. The other day I was using the Hopper app to book a hotel, and it wasn't until I confirmed my payment that I realized my hotel was $10 more expensive. It turns out Hopper assumed I wanted to add a tip, and I had to go back to a prior page in order to opt out.
That's crazy. Landlords who are asking for tips now. That's tipping culture out of control. The other thing too is that tips, they get taxed. There are a lot of workers in coffee shop type establishment who go, you don't need to tip me $1. It's fine.
Guilted into tipping on something that is not technically a service. It's someone simply doing their job. In those situations, consumers are feeling resentful. Where do you draw the line?
TIP stands for to ensure promptness. Tipping may go back as far as the Roman era, but according to most experts, the practice likely has its origins in medieval Europe.
One theory is that it evolved in eating and drinking establishments as a way to forestall envy, that when you're eating and drinking, you're having fun, and the people who are serving you are not.
Fast forward to the 19th century, when waiters who received a full wage went on strike demanding higher wages, they were replaced with women who employers could pay less. A decade later, there was the population of newly freed slaves.
Hey, wait a second. That sounds like some feminazi bullshit. What would Piers Morgan have to say about that?
Restaurant owners was that they were giving the luxury or privilege of a white person's tips. That was without a full wage.
Ironically, as tipping exploded in the United States, it became less common in Europe and was replaced with service charges.
While the first federal minimum wage law was passed in 1938, it wasn't until almost 3 decades later when the tip minimum wage was established. In 1991, the federal minimum wage for tipped employees was set at $2.13, which is what it remains at as of March 2023.
As far as I know, the United States is the only country that exempts tipped workers from having to receive the full minimum wage.
Which is insane.
In 43 states, it is legal to pay tipped workers less than the standard minimum wage.
That is fucked up. When we talk about tipping culture, it is never the fault of the workers. And it's why so many service workers rely on tips. Of course, we want the responsibility to be on the employers, not the customers. But you as an individual going, I'm not going to tip because these employers should be the ones who are legally obligated to pay their workers a living wage. Like, yeah, they should be. But you doing a individual boycott of tipping is not going to make these employers then be legally obligated to pay minimum wage. You can tell with restaurants where they have adopted a no tipping culture. The waiter will explain to you from the beginning, or it'll have it on the menu or on the website or whatever. That's still something that is not commonplace. If you're at a restaurant, you should assume that the workers are not being paid minimum wage.
In recent years, you might have found yourself asking, do I tip this barista for pouring that hot coffee? What about when I'm going to a restaurant and picking up takeout? And how much do I tip that doorman, driver, or dog walker?
When those in the service industry were feeling the brunt during the coronavirus pandemic, consumers started tipping for things they never had before. And the percentage of remote transactions when tipping was an option in which the consumer tipped soared from about 46% before the pandemic to around 86% in January 2022. If people were willing to tip the person delivering food to their home 30%, why not ask if they'd like to tip when they come pick up?
During the pandemic, businesses who lost a lot of traditional customers and transactions were looking for alternative ways to make up that income. If asking for tips was one way to do it, they were willing to try it.
And since then, that ask hasn't dissipated. Another reason consumers say they feel pressured to tip more? They're being asked to tip prior to service completion.
Yeah, and I would say in that concert situation where you and your boyfriend tipped for somebody grabbing merch shirts, I guarantee you at least part of those tips go to the company.
Customers might not be concerned about the barista's perception of their tip before getting their latte, but what about the mechanic repairing your car? I don't know about you, but I'm certainly going to make sure to tip them well to ensure my safety.
Another reason consumers are tipping more? Newer technologies. According to a 2022 creditcards.com survey, 22% of respondents said when they're presented with various suggested tip amounts, they feel pressured to tip more than they normally would.
They use those options as an indication of kind of what the normative range is and feel compelled to tip within that range. So the more you ask, the more you get.
The 3 prominent companies with that trendy, sleek look are Square, Toast, and Clover, all in one point of sale or POS systems. In some cases, fewer fees so it's less of a burden to accept multiple credit cards, no long-term contracts, and multiple other useful tools including inventory and employee management.
They got credit card processing into the hands of individuals and very small merchants. Square did a great job. It's been a tremendous growth story. That's half of the business today.
Do you think these companies are responsible for this turn of events that we've seen with tipping?
I would say they could take some of the credit for helping restaurants gather more tips.
Robert Sanchez manages Eli's Essentials in New York City. One of the business's locations uses Toast, while the other uses this. He says the storefront that uses Toast sees more and higher tips.
In that situation, that looks like that's what, a little grocery store? The customers should not be having to tip, and therefore the businesses are able to not be held responsible for increasing the wages of the workers, even in situations where they do pay at least minimum wage.
The new tablets have turned what used to be a sin of omission, I simply didn't put money into the tip jar, into a sin of commission. I have to hit a button and say no tip. I have to actively choose not to tip. Whereas before, not tipping was a kind of a passive thing.
Glancing at the tip jar could have also been a way to get a sense of how many others are tipping on that service and maybe even how much money. Meanwhile, not only can the tipping options be customized, but the tipping feature can be disabled as well. So it's the merchant's choice to ask or not to ask for tips.
From the business side, it makes employees want to perform better and do a better job.
It's seriously significant. It really pays for the software. You'd be a foolish business owner not to install it based on what the numbers display. Even a mammoth company as large as Starbucks has decided that they need to sink or swim, and the best way for them to do that is to offer the tip screen.
Starbucks rolled out the tipping feature in stores in September 2022.
It's one thing to have a happy staff. It's another thing to have customers that are feeling resentful. I think it's a calculus that all business owners really need to make.
Right, and the workers are caught in the middle. They're not being paid enough. Of course they want tips. Like if the business owner comes in there like, hey y'all, we got the iPad. Things are gonna be better for you now. Yeah, the workers are caught between a rock and a hard place where they need those tips. They need more money. They understand how awkward it is because they're also people who are out and about in the world, right? They're also like being faced with this imposition. There's definitely a psychology that is at play here. If you're in line with somebody and they tip on something, then you'll feel more pressure to tip on something. Or like if you are someone that you're trying to impress, you're more likely to hit the tip button.
You think that they're somewhat going to start seeing that they're getting lower tips because people are paying tips to so many services, or they're resentful of the act of tipping in general?
I think that's a very real danger of servers in a sit-down restaurant. They were greatly affected during and immediately post-pandemic by restaurants doing all sorts of fees. Their tips were actually going down because consumers were saying, well, if I'm paying for the health insurance and I'm paying for inflation and I'm paying for this and I'm paying for that, enough is enough. The more you levy these line items onto consumers, guess who's being penalized?
A 2022 study found that 17% of Americans are tipping less because of inflation. However, 10% report tipping more. At the same time, more than half of Americans, or 60%, want to do away with tipping entirely. The extent of pandemic-influenced generosity has also gone down. 43% of consumers typically tipped servers 20% or more in 2022, compared to 56% of consumers in 2021. Meanwhile, the average tip for full-service restaurants has gone down only slightly during the same time period. According to Toast, 19.6% in the fourth quarter of 2022, compared to 19.8% in 2021. However, according to surveys conducted in those same years, respondents said they're tipping higher percentages, 21.2% and 18.9% respectively.
It can genuinely hurt the people who truly, truly rely on gratuities for their livelihood. I firmly believe that the tipping invasion we're experiencing right now, I think it's a net negative for society.
And with that tablet at just about every counter, no matter where you go, the question is, where's the tipping point? I'm wondering how long before I'm tipping my doctor after an annual physical.
So it was interesting because when I was in Europe, friends of mine who had never been to Europe were very surprised at the quality of service in restaurants. Now, I thought it was perfectly fine. Did they take their sweet time? Yeah, but that's because everybody in Europe takes their sweet time. But friends who were coming from America who had never been to Europe, I could tell that they were flummoxed and sometimes frustrated by how the service was whenever we would go out in Paris. And I explained to them, I'm like, that's because you're used to coming from America where everybody is working for a tip. So you are used to this like, oh, the customer is always right, bowing down type culture because they're relying on getting tips from you so that they can pay rent.
We just picked up Thai food, okay? Now Frankie's mad at me because we picked it up.
Dude, you're broke ass.
So can't tip
You don't
people.
tip on. You don't when you pick up food. You don't tip. Okay.
Dude, I don't care. I've been going to that restaurant twice a week the last 10 years, and I always.
Okay, I'm a little freaked out because the guy with the hood on his head looks exactly like my ex-boyfriend from college. And if I had not heard the name Frankie, I'd be like, is that him? I don't like the guy saying you don't tip on takeout. I'm not going to guilt you. I think it's a personal decision. I also don't think this guy should be like, no, you do not tip on takeout. Like that's a rule. There's no rules, right? I tip on takeout because I tend to go to the same places and I like to go to neighborhood spots. Same with what this guy said, where he's like, I love this place. They know me by name. There's a familiarity there.
So I go to Ben & Jerry's yesterday and I just wanted a cone. Just wanted a nice, fresh, warm cone. So I walk over to the counter and I was like, hi, can I just have a waffle cone? And she was like, yeah, sure. Here you go. That'll be $2. So I was like, okay. I go to put my card in and of course the tipping screen comes up. And I was like, I didn't say this out loud, but in my head I was like, I'm not tipping you on a cone. You literally just handed me a cone. And I'm also like, the percentages were insane. I was like, I'm not tipping you $1 on a $2 cone that you just handed me. I'm not. So she hands me my cone. I put my card in. It gives me like, how much do you want to tip? I hit no tip. And the cashier goes to my face, to my actual face. Like on no planet is that ever appropriate. Even if I got $100 worth of ice cream and I don't tip you, you can't to the customer. On top of that, Miss Girl, what were you expecting I tipped you to hand me a cone?
She kind of lost me there. That's the customer is always right. Even if I got $100 worth of ice cream, you can never do this. First of all, the service worker absolutely can. Should the Ben & Jerry's employee guilted her into tipping on a $2 cone? No, I don't think so. I wouldn't.
What are your thoughts on tipping culture in Canada?
If you can't afford to tip, don't go out.
You know what? That's a really good way to look at it.
Guy. If you can't afford to tip, don't go out. Anyway, I'm single, lady, 6 feet, got a good job.
I'm a bartender, so it's
okay. Yeah.
I need to put food on the table. You know what I mean?
Okay, actually, as a bartender, yeah, he does have the experience of like, if you come to the bar and you order a drink, please tip me.
This will be an ongoing battle until we decide what services actually need tipping, or we just get rid of it altogether.
Or until we get these motherfucking businesses to pay workers good, fair wages. It sucks that everyday people are being put in this position because they are also exploited workers. Exploited workers having to deal with the tipping issue with other exploited workers. It's a very personal thing as well because of the judgments that arise when one person is like on this side and then someone else is on the other side. And at the end of the day, I think we all agree that the responsibility should not be on the customer, aka us, who are also exploited workers, whom are just trying to get by as well. But unfortunately, when we go out to eat, when we order food, we do need to be tipping on those services because those employees then otherwise cannot afford to live. In those situations, I'm not saying like you go get a coffee or you go get, you self-service car wash, you have to tip. If you're going out to dinner, you need to be able to tip. If you're ordering dinner, someone's delivering it to you, you need to be able to tip.